Okay, I think we're going to get started here. I wanted to thank you all for coming into our Customer Support Series webinar. This one will focus on acing your summer provisioning with DEP. So just so you know, we have about a half hour or so of content to cover on various topics. We'll try to get through it all and have some time at the end for questions. We do have people moderating our questions and answers, so if you want to ask a question at any time, you can do so and place that in the Q&A section of the WebEx, and we'll get to it at the end. There's also a chat feature, which I would recommend only using if you have technical difficulties. Otherwise, put any kind of content-related questions in that Q&A section. This webinar will be recorded and available for viewing at a later time. We'll have that up shortly after the end of this webinar. But I do thank you all for attending. Getting started today, your hosts are myself, John Applebaugh. I'm the Customer Engagement Manager here at Jamf. And joining me today is Camden Webster. He's our Technical Support Engineer. So broadly speaking, we wanted to cover a lot of topics related to provisioning, that summer kind of reprovisioning that you might be thinking about or going through, and really with a focus a lot on DEP, the Device Enrollment Program, talking about some of the advantages configuring DEP within Jamf Pro, as well as using it for both iOS and Mac OS. We'll also cover some specific workflows for provisioning and reprovisioning on both platforms. And again, there will be time at the end for questions. Just put that in the Q&A section within the WebEx window. So getting started, just kind of wanted to cover what is DEP to make sure we're all on the same page. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the Device Enrollment Program, but speaking, it is a program from Apple that allows for a fast delivery and streamlined way to deploy your institutionally owned devices. We provided a couple links here for Apple documentation, as well as the jamf.it quick link to our KB on setting up your DEP settings within Jamf Pro. Just broadly speaking, if you have devices that were purchased directly from Apple or through a reseller, you would be able to add them into DEP. If you purchase them outside of DEP, if there is a workflow within iOS to get them into DEP that we'll cover today, but broadly speaking, as long as they purchased from Apple or a reseller before or after, on or after March 1st of 2011, they should be eligible for DEP. It should be noted that Device Enrollment Program is not available in all countries, but it is available in many. Additionally, you do have to have an account set up with Apple in order to use DEP, or Apple School Manager would be the other option. To get started, like I mentioned, you'll need to have an account set up within Apple School Manager. We provided that quick link again on how to get started with our DEP and Jamf Pro, but here is the link for Apple School Manager setup. You'll need to have an organizational email address that's not already being used as an Apple ID, and then you'll be asked to provide some verification details, contact information, as well as your Apple customer number or a DEP reseller ID. Switching to kind of why you should use DEP, we have Camden. Thanks.
All right, thanks, John. So in discussing some of the advantages with DEP, let's start with some of the workflow enhancements that DEP offers. So the primary enhancements is just a quick provisioning process of new devices. So this can really empower IT to quickly get these devices out the door, outside of maybe attaching an asset tag. You hardly even need to open the box. Just give the device right to the user, and the end user runs through that enrollment process themselves. We can also skip various steps within the setup assistant that might not be relevant to the end users, kind of speed up that enrollment process. iOS devices are also automatically supervised over the air, so this allows us to achieve the full iOS management experience. We can also automate the entire provisioning process pretty much end-to-end. So devices can automatically be added to smart groups upon enrollment, and then begin running policies or install apps configuration profiles as soon as that enrollment completes. Some of the management features on the iOS side are only available with DEP. One such feature would be remote iOS upgrades. All right, so we can also achieve a number of security enhancements. So once DEP once DEP is tied to a pre-stage enrollment in Jamf Pro, the devices within that DEP program will always be prompted to enroll in Jamf Pro during the setup assistance, even after a wipe. We can also prevent the MDM profile from being removed. We can also require user authentication during enrollments, which has two primary benefits. The first is that it can prevent an unauthorized user from enrolling the device into your production Jamf environment. It could also be helpful if devices are sold after a refresh cycle, and you're not going to disown them in the Apple deployment program. An additional second benefit is that Jamf Pro will also pull the user and location information from a connected directory server and then add it directly to the device's inventory record for easy scoping based on username, groups, buildings, departments, and so on. Additionally, DEP enrollments and supervision in general allows us to geolocate devices based on lost mode. And finally, we can also use various configuration profiles to control certain iOS functions, apply restrictions to a supervised device. All right, so what was life like without DEP? So other methods of enrollments, such as user-initiated enrollments, or even Apple Configurator 2, are a bit more time-consuming and don't offer some of the security benefits that DEP offers. So even supervision with Apple Configurator 2 limits the ability to remotely update the iOS version, and you also can't prevent the MDM profile from being removed. On the Mac OS side, imaging is becoming a bit antiquated, especially with the arrival of Mac OS High Sierra, and it's a fairly time-consuming process to get set up. Thin imaging via DEP and policies can offer a much better end-user experience and a more modular workflow for IT as well. If we didn't have pre-stage enrollments, we wouldn't be able to create some of the additional local users or bind to a directory service during the setup assistance on Mac OS. We wouldn't be able to name iOS devices prior to enrollments. We also wouldn't be able to skip various parts of the setup assistant that aren't relevant to the end user.
So as summer starts, we might be planning, or maybe have already planned, to provision some new devices or maybe reprovisioning existing ones in iOS particularly. So starting with that, if we're just getting started, we should probably consider a few things for provisioning our iOS devices. Things like, are we going to be using a one-to-one model for device deployment, or is this kind of a shared scenario where the device is shared among different users? In that regard, is authentication needed as part of that enrollment process? Additionally, are these devices brand new, directly purchased from Apple or wherever, or have they been previously enrolled either within Jamf or another MDM? Additionally, in that case, do the apps and the data associated to the user need to transfer once that device is reprovisioned? Are these devices part of your device enrollment program? And if so, is supervision going to be needed? And at this point, most folks that are using iOS devices, especially within an education setting, are going to want to use some supervision. Even if you don't intend to necessarily use all the features of supervision, it's just nice to have from the get-go in case you do need to lock down certain features or take advantage of some of those supervision-only features of Jamf Pro and MDM. So DEP allows for a quick way, as we mentioned, to enroll devices. If we're already connected to DEP or Apple School Manager, we would just want to create a new pre-stage enrollment or update the scope of an existing pre-stage. For any new devices that you might be adding, we would also want to make sure those devices are showing up in Apple School Manager and that they're associated to the Jamf MDM server connection. This will make them available for scoping. So here we're just showing you that you can create a pre-stage enrollment under mobile devices, pre-stage enrollments. For the settings that you might want to use, we'll want to make sure to supervise the devices and make the MDM profile mandatory. Additionally, we'll want to prevent the removal of the MDM, which in this case is prevent unenrollment. If you don't have that box checked, your end user could go into system settings and manually remove the MDM profile, which for iOS devices basically will break enrollment. You might also want to consider adding pairing as an option as part of your pre-stage enrollment. It's not required, but it could be helpful in the future if for whatever reason you need to do some troubleshooting, and you can connect that device to a Mac computer and figure out what might have gone wrong, or maybe try a different workflow. If you check the box for require authentication, you'll be actually taking advantage of the connection you have with LDAP or a directory service like that to be able to assign the user to the device. User and location can actually be pulled from your LDAP, but depending on what kind of mappings you're using, or if you've added additional LDAP settings, they may not all be pulled in during enrollment. So, however, without LDAP, without those mappings coming in, you could still update this information from a CSV file in mass using a tool like the Mass Update tool. We can also skip a lot of parts of the setup assistant. This might streamline your process if you're having to do lots of devices yourself as part of your provisioning, or if you're handing it off to the end user and you don't want them to either be able to enable these or just get confused during the whole setup process. Likewise, on iOS, we can actually set a naming convention that we want to use during enrollment. Here we're setting it to serial numbers and enforcing the mobile device name, which you can do when it's supervised. We're making a prefix and suffix if necessary, but essentially it's just going to take whatever the serial number of that device is and set it to be the username. This option is not currently available for any Mac OS computers, so it's just an iOS specific feature set right now. Even if you didn't purchase your devices directly from Apple or one of the authorized resellers, we can still add them to DEP within the latest version of Apple Configurator. Apple Configurator is a Mac App Store app you can download for free. 2.5 or later is, I think it's on 2.7 now, of versioning, but essentially you need that latest version in order to do this workflow. We didn't go into detail for this webinar, but there's a great video that we just published at jamf.it/acdep. There's a quick link there. Takes you to a YouTube video that we put together for how to actually add your devices into DEP via Apple Configurator 2. They do need to be iOS 11 or greater, and once they're added into DEP, they'll actually be provisionally added into your DEP account, which means there's a cancel option within the settings of the device where the user could go in and remove from management. After 30 days, it's more permanently added to your DEP account. So just something to keep in mind if you're going to use this workflow. Maybe plan out to do this a month or two ahead of time before handing it off to an end user or student. What's great about that workflow too is the fact that you can actually then leverage your DEP pre-stage in the future. You won't have to go back to Apple School Manager to then do any kind of re-enrollment or supervision. You can just rely on DEP workflows. Shared iPads is a newer feature of iPads and Apple School Manager. You might be familiar in general with the concept of sharing a device among different users. Traditionally, this was done in a cart-based deployment where they were all set up through Apple Configurator and then issued out, maybe 1 or 2 devices per class that all students used, or 30 devices that just kind of got swapped among different students in the class. However, Apple introduced this idea of a shared iPad, which is actually one device that has several different users tied to that one single device. The important concept to remember here is that it's just a sharing of the device specifically and not of the content associated on the device. So each user will have their own profile that they can log into, see their own app, see their own work that they've been doing. There are specific hardware requirements to use shared iPads. They do have to be a little bit more high-powered iPads. There are more details on this within Apple School Manager as well as available online. But generally speaking, iPad Pros as well as the iPad Air 2s and later, iPad Mini 4 or later, and it has to be at least a 32 gigabyte device. Depending on what hardware you use, it's going to determine how many users you can add to that single device, as well as the concept of managed Apple IDs are important here as well. Basically, a managed Apple ID is separate from a standard Apple ID. It's institutionally owned. You would set it up within Apple School Manager, and you can restrict certain activities and behaviors of that Apple ID depending on what you're looking to do. But these are important if you're going to use any sort of shared iPad deployment through DEP to have managed Apple IDs for your users to use. Provided a quick link here for Apple documentation on both the managed Apple ID as well as Apple School Manager to give you more in-depth information if that's what you're looking for. If you happen to have any plans to reprovision devices this summer from existing devices, there is additionally some points you might want to consider for that specifically. If we're planning to redistribute devices to different users than were originally assigned to, we can reclaim any kind of VPP licenses associated to that device, either within that mobile device app setting and unscoping whatever devices there are, or if you need to do it globally, it can be done within the VPP token and revoking all content. It's important to note that this only applies to apps. Ebooks cannot be redistributed, so there isn't a need to reclaim or revoke or anything like that. Also, activation lock can definitely cause hiccups for an organization during the summer months if you're trying to reissue devices to new users. So essentially, when a user logs into iCloud or Find My iPhone for the first time, they're enabling activation lock. And so what that does is, if the device gets wiped, the user or whoever receives that device would have to enter a code or log into iCloud in order to get into the device, into the home screen. On supervised devices in Jamf Pro, we can actually bypass the activation lock since the bypass code is collected as part of standard inventory. So for devices that are not supervised, or maybe pre-iOS 7, which is when activation lock came into play, we would need the user to first log out of iCloud before returning the device, or they can log out of that particular device on iCloud.com. The only other option besides that, if for whatever reason the user is not available, would be to contact Apple and see about removing the activation lock on that device. For any return devices, we can actually remove this en masse to make it easier before wiping. Or if we need to do it on an individual basis, again, that code is located within the inventory record. But once devices are wiped, we can actually have them go through a process of enrolling again through DEP, and definitely supervision can be put in place at that time as well. Just quickly, what activation lock bypass is located under the management tab of the inventory record. Just a button there to show you the activation bypass code that can be entered on the device. You can also clear the activation code lock en masse using a wipe command. Here we're showing a mobile device group, send a remote command, and choosing the wipe device. From there, it will drop down additional options, of which one is the clear activation lock. In 10.4 of Jamf Pro, we also now have the option to suppress the proximity setup. That's on iOS 11.3 or later, so a newer feature, but essentially this is a setup assistant feature that happens before the device even connects to a Wi-Fi network, so it hasn't received any DEP instructions at this point. It essentially allows the user to use a nearby Apple device to get set up. So essentially take their Wi-Fi settings, if it happens to be the same user, and be able to set up the device. To prevent that from happening, which is ideal, we would just need to check this box when wiping the device. I think even if this isn't something that your users know about or use at all, it's still a good idea to have the suppress proximity set up as part of your wipe workflow. So now that we've talked a lot about iOS, we're going to switch platforms for Camden's sake.
All right, thanks, John. So on the Mac OS side, there are a number of considerations we'll want to make when provisioning machines. A lot of the similar considerations. So are these computers going to be in a lab, or are they going to be one-to-one devices? Is the provisioning process going to be centralized to the IT department, or are we going to empower the end users to set up their own devices on their own? Are we going to require authentication, so we're going to bind to a directory server or anything like that, or are end users just going to create their own local accounts? All right, and are these devices a part of the DEP program? Can we utilize a pre-stage enrollment within Jamf Pro to get these devices enrolled, or do we have to look at another option? So assuming that these devices are tied to the DEP program, we're going to go ahead and create a new pre-stage enrollment within Jamf Pro under the Computers tab. So in order to get these machines enrolled with a pre-stage, we'll first have to make sure that we configure our user-initiated enrollment settings within Jamf Pro for Mac OS. This is where our management account settings are configured, so the username and password of that management account that gets created on the device and allows us to manage the device using Jamf Pro. So once we've configured all of the options that we want under the Options tab, we'll jump over to the Scope tab, and we'll just select the checkbox next to each device that we want to tie to that pre-stage enrollment. Now this list is populated directly from the Device Enrollment Program or from Apple School Manager. So these aren't devices that are currently enrolled in your Jamf Pro instance, but these are just devices that we've purchased, are tied to our MDM server in Apple School Manager, and are ready to be tied to a pre-stage for enrollment in the future.
So as Camden mentioned, there's a lot you can do with DEP, but one of the things that I wanted to highlight here for both iOS and Mac OS is that automatically assign new devices. It's definitely preferred if you're using only one pre-stage in your environment. If you happen to have multiple pre-stages, it maybe isn't the most ideal scenario to use this particular feature. It's a global setting. If you happen to make use of sites, you can actually set up additional DEP server connections within your DEP portal or Apple School Manager portal, create additional Jamf MDM for each site that you might have, and then you would just need to make sure you're assigning your devices to the correct MDM connection within Apple School Manager. This allows you to create a pre-stage within each site and then have each specific DEP connection automatically assign new devices to that particular pre-stage. So it's just a filtering mechanism as you're getting new devices, and maybe 10 have to go to one school and 20 have to go to another school. If you just have separate connections to DEP within your Apple School Manager portal and within the Jamf Pro server, you can have those automatically filter into a specific pre-stage for you. Additionally, I wanted to make sure we highlight some things to prevent the removal of any kind of management from the device. That's really kind of one of the main key points of using the device enrollment program. If you check the box to make the MDM profile mandatory, as well as uncheck the allow MDM profile removal or remove management, that prevents those end users from being able to take out the MDM profile, which would break a lot of the management features that we have to offer through Jamf Pro. And additionally, on iOS, there is that supervise option, which, as we've kind of stated, and maybe you're already aware, has a lot of abilities to lock down devices, restrict users from doing certain things that I think you should definitely consider taking advantage of. Additionally, just recap on the LDAP or single sign-on solution that you might have. The require authentication will actually use those settings to associate or log in and associate that user to the device. It's pretty important if those are up to date and accurate, and make sure that that's working. Otherwise, it could fail during that enrollment process. In a lab setting, this might not be necessary to have authentication, since you have a lot of different devices that need to be set up all at once. The directory payload for macOS configures that directory binding. So if you happen to use Active Directory or another binding situation, you can use that payload. However, just keep in mind that it does increase enrollment time, because of course we're trying to connect to another server to make that bind happen. And so enrollment kind of waits until that particular bind completes in order to say enrollment's finished. Likewise, there's the option for creating additional counts during DEP pre-stage. Just want to highlight the fact that the management account for macOS is already being created. So in many cases, you don't need to set additional accounts to be created at enrollment. If you're using labs, you could just make use of the guest user, and then we can just skip the account creation entirely. Outside of enrollment, we would recommend maybe using a policy to create those local accounts if you need them, maybe an additional admin account or something like that. You can do that through a policy. Policies can also remove existing user accounts. Say if you need to get rid of a guest account or get rid of a user account that may have been accidentally created during enrollment or something like that, policies are a great way to do that. And also I wanted to highlight that there's definitely a lot of great features within Jamf Pro for pre-stage enrollment. If you're looking for maybe some more customization or enhancing that end user experience during the DEP enrollment part, there are some third parties that have put together some great tools that are available on the Jamf marketplace. A lot of them are open source, and I think it's useful just to check out that marketplace to see what options you might have or things that you might want to think about testing out to see if it would improve your overall deployment. And lastly, I just wanted to mention the enrollment location on your pre-stage. You can actually set department and buildings as part of that pre-stage enrollment. So in this case, if you are not pulling that information from LDAP, you could set that here within the pre-stage settings. What this would allow you to do is the device enrolls, it would be automatically tied to a building or department, and then you could target those departments or buildings within the scope of policies or profiles or apps or whatever else you need to send out to those computers. So switching back to sort of the overall workflow for Mac OS, we just wanted to touch on some options for reprovisioning.
All right, thanks, John. So once we have a solid provisioning framework in place for the Mac OS side, we'll want to consider how we're going to get those older machines on a clean slate for the new school year. So the considerations are fairly similar to the original provisioning process. We're going to want to determine how we want these machines to be set up, if they're going to be in labs or one-to-one, if we're going to be binding to Active Directory, and if these devices are also a part of DEP. And also the version of Mac OS is going to determine how we proceed with our reprovisioning process. So the first workflow we'll cover here is issuing an old device to a new user. So let's say that computer's returned to IT. We can use Jamf Pro to issue a wipe command from the Jamf Pro web interface. And then once that machine boots back up, reinstalls its operating system, we can utilize the device enrollment program to re-enroll that device into Jamf Pro.
So Camden, what if it's a scenario where they don't have DEP or don't have this device in DEP on Mac OS?
So yeah, that's a good question. So once the end user returns that computer to IT, we can still use that same web command because it's still enrolled. But instead of using DEP, we'll want to leverage user-initiated enrollments. All right, so similarly, in a lab setting, new High Sierra computers can be added to DEP if they're eligible. Without DEP, we'd want to go ahead and use user-initiated enrollments. So either of these methods will allow us to enroll with High Sierra and also have a user-approved MDM profile automatically approved. All right, so kind of jumping into the user-approved MDM side a little bit here. So if you're not familiar with the concept already, Apple introduced the concept of user-approved MDM starting in macOS 10.13.2. So according to some of Apple's documentation on user-approved MDM, it'll currently be needed to manage certain settings on Macs, currently the approval or whitelisting of third-party kernel extensions on Macs. So only computers enrolled via DEP or machines that were enrolled prior to upgrading to 10.13.2 will have user-approved MDM. Starting with Jamf Pro 10.3, we did introduce the functionality to allow for user-approved MDM during that user-initiated enrollment process. So if you're running 10.3 Jamf Pro or later, you'll have that ability as well. All right, so kind of continuing the user-approved MDM saga here. Obviously, devices enrolled with DEP will automatically have a user-approved MDM status. Without user-approved MDM, user approval for some third-party applications will be required. So, like we kind of mentioned before, any device that was already enrolled prior to 10.13.2 and had that MDM profile installed will be grandfathered in. Those devices won't necessarily need to be user approved, and we can still issue a configuration profile for those third-party kernel extensions to those machines. Otherwise, if the machine isn't user approved, if the MDM profile isn't user approved, we can still manually approve that that MDM profile on the machine manually. If you're not familiar with what that prompt looks like, here's a quick screenshot. We'll have to navigate into System Preferences, Profiles, and then click on the MDM profile to approve the profile. So this can only be done locally on the machine. We can't do it through an ARD session. We can't really script it. It has to be done with the physical keyboard and mouse that are attached to that computer. All right, so typically when we use the wipe command to reprovision a device from Jamf Pro, we'll either have to leverage the recovery partition or maybe internet recovery to reinstall the operating system, so that can take quite a while. There are a couple of tricks, however, that we can use to speed up this process. So starting with 10.13.4 Mac OS, we have a flag within this little binary inside of the Mac OS installer. So prior to 10.13.4, we could use this binary to perform an in-place upgrade, but now with 10.13.4, we can actually erase the drive prior to installing the operating system. So as long as we have the Mac OS installer downloaded from the App Store cached just somewhere locally on the machine, we can kick off that binary with just a simple one-line command that will wipe the drive, reboot the machine, and then proceed with the installation process. It takes about 7 to 10 minutes to get that OS installed on an SSD. And then additionally, we can also use the install package flag to install various packages that are also cached on the machine. We can even use a quick add package with a couple small tweaks to kind of automate that enrollment process. However, we won't have the user approved MDM status, unfortunately. So a few other options we can use to get machines wiped and potentially upgraded to High Sierra. We could use the disk utility within the recovery partition to wipe that drive and then get the operating system reinstalled. We could also build out a bootable installer from, say, a USB drive or an external hard drive, even Thunderbolt. We could also utilize a net install image and then re-enroll that way. Unfortunately, net install is going to be deprecated within the server application. There are some alternatives out there, but not necessarily the most up-to-date workflow, unfortunately. And if the machines are running pre-High Sierra, we could look at leveraging some of the more traditional imaging workflows, if possible.
Okay, so thank you for joining us again today. We did get through everything that we wanted to cover today. Appreciate you guys attending. I just wanted to remind you that we will be having a recorded version of this available online shortly thereafter this webinar is concluded. We have taken down some of your questions here. If you didn't get a chance to yet, you can definitely put that into the Q&A section of the WebEx in your navigation. We'll be able to see those questions and hopefully get you some answers here. And we're just going to review some here for a second and take a look at what we can answer for you today. So one of our questions from Paul was around creating a management account in Jamf Cloud specifically. Whether or not that's something that is still working. I think we're in agreement here that the management account gets created during that enrollment process through DEP, as well as any other method of enrollment. DEP specifically, as we mentioned, is pulling that management account from your user-initiated enrollment setting. So as long as it's specified there, I wouldn't see any potential for it not to be created during enrollment. So a question kind of came in from Neil along the lines of that user sort of specific data that might be on a computer and how to get that backup or whatever onto the new DEP device. And I think I'm not sure if that's Mac OS or iOS, but
yeah. So for iOS specifically, we can see some issues if we are restoring an iTunes backup to the same device. We can see some issues surrounding supervision and management, having that MDM profile restored to the device. However, if the devices are different, say if we're refreshing our devices and those unique identifiers on the device don't match, that should be a bit more stable, and users should be able to restore their information a bit more successfully. I believe Apple does have a knowledge base article as well that kind of runs through some of those various scenarios and what kinds of behavior we can expect to see there.
Just to cover again in a little bit more detail, just to on the reprovisioning side, as we're getting at some additional questions, I just wanted to backtrack a little bit and just mention that, as you're provisioning or reprovisioning devices, if you're going through a process of revoking apps and removing devices from MDM and then re-enrolling them and redeploying apps, depending on how many you're doing and the timing of that, you might see a lot of increased network load and increased strain on the environment during those times. So just something to be aware of as you're planning this out, that you might have to space out some of those activities, not try to push everything through at once. Otherwise, it just takes a lot longer to have everything go through.
Yeah, so a question from Jared here about how we would actually go through a zero-touch DEP enrollment with computers for like in a lab scenario, for example, to kind of replicate that imaging workflow. So unfortunately, with DEP, that setup assistant is a required piece of the puzzle. There's unfortunately no way we can really skip the entire setup assistant. So to have a truly zero-touch experience where, let's say the machine is out in the wild, we go ahead and issue that wipe command to wipe it remotely. There really isn't any way with DEP at this time to get that device enrolled and get through that setup system without having to physically touch it. There may be some ways in the future to maybe utilize that erase install command that I mentioned earlier with the start OS install binary to get the device enrolled using, say, a quick add package. However, that wouldn't give us the user approved MDM status. So maybe an option if we're not doing too much with those third-party kernel extensions, is that's the primary reason we need to get that MDM profile user approved. However, with DEP, there's really not a whole lot we can do in terms of a true zero-touch imaging like reprovisioning process.
Switching topics a little bit, Brad asked about a workflow for passing the secure token for FileVault 2 for the management account or any additional admin accounts. We didn't cover that in depth only because it's a narrower scope of topic than what this webinar was going to cover. I think we've touched on this in other settings, but there is possibility of being able to have a new secure token. So what we're talking about is a FileVault 2 is encryption for Mac OS. With High Sierra, there's now a requirement that each user that's FileVault enabled has a secure token issued to it. Before High Sierra, there wasn't a secure token part of that process. It was you just added users into the FileVault 2 as enabled users. But with High Sierra, you do have to have a secure token. There is a way to have that token issued for additional users. It could be done locally on the machine. To do it remotely would require a more scripted workflow at this time. And part of that workflow is to have a current enabled FileVault user with a secure token authenticate to issue a new secure token. So you could see how this is somewhat of a chicken and the egg problem a little bit, but there are potential options to have that scripted and sort of make it a little bit more secure script in order to get that token issued for additional users. Camden, you have other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the specific scenario that the user was trying to outline here is when the end user of the machine runs through the setup assistant themselves, they create their local user, they are actually going to be the one and only user on the machine that gets that secure token. So at that point, we need to somehow prompt the end user to allow them to grant a secure token to, say, a management account or another local admin that's controlled by IT. There are a couple of scripts out there that work very well for this scenario. There's one out there by actually a Jamf employee that's works pretty well. It's been tested quite a bit here in-house. So essentially it'll prompt the end user for their password. You can kind of do a little bit of branding on the logo to make sure it's not make sure it looks trustworthy. And then once the end user is prompted for their password, that will issue a secure token to any other local account that we choose based on the settings within the script. So it's fairly simple to get set up. If it's something you're looking to do, definitely reach out to Jamf support and we can help you with that.
Yeah, in that regard, in that vein too, I would say that's something that, for more information, definitely touch base with Jamf, either support or your representative. There might be some kind of discussions around that topic on Jamf Nation as well, but I think that's a good starting point. Encryption in general definitely has some different caveats now with High Sierra that are definitely worth investigating before you get to that stage. So another question came in from Michael with around the concept of being able to, as part of your summer provisioning or workflow here, of updating those devices from a previous OS, so pre-High Sierra to the latest and greatest, which right now is 10.13.4. And they're just kind of wondering what that process would look like in order to get them to install that latest update. And I think there's a couple different scenarios you could use to make that happen, just depending on how many you're having to deal with at a time, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's correct. So kind of his question was, would the workflow be to make sure the machines are turned on, connected to the network, checking into Jamf Pro, and then cache the installer locally on the machine, and then kick it off with that start OS install command? That is correct. So we'd want to make sure that we do have that 10.13 installer cached on the machine locally. Once it's there, we can kind of do this with smart groups as well to automate the process a little bit. Once it's there, we would kick off the installer using the start OS install command. And just to kind of plug this again as well, we do have a bit more information on that start OS install, a link to an Apple KB at jamf.it/startOSinstall, jamf.it/startOSinstall. So for this workflow, this would essentially be an in-place upgrade. If we wanted to both erase the machine and get it upgraded to macOS High Sierra from Sierra, we could just add the additional erase install flag onto that command. So pretty simple change just to make it or flip the workflow from an upgrade to a wipe and upgrade.
So if you haven't had a chance to get your question in, I think we're just going to wait a few more seconds here just to see if other questions that we can take during the webinar. So we had a question kind of along the lines regarding iOS specifically, being able to wipe devices, which in every scenario will wipe the device completely, bring it back to like a fresh out of the box iOS device. Whether or not they're, and so one of the issues with that is you have to then, before you get even to DEP enrollment, you have to connect it to a network in order to get those DEP settings and get everything else. So I guess the question is there a way to kind of speed up that process through any alternative workflows out there that they could wipe a lot of the information off the device but keep the MDM profile, keep the enrollments still there? And to my knowledge, I don't think there's a great way to do that. There are some options to, reset settings and things like that, but app data would still remain. I think I think I see where it's coming from. We're just trying to speed up that process of enrollment a little bit. Having an open Wi-Fi network is one option. Even for the short period of time that you need to do re-enrollments, of just having an open network so they can connect quickly, start doing the enrollment process, and get everything going. Camden, any other thoughts that you might have on that one?
Yeah, just kind of like John said, anything we can do to really speed up that process is probably what we'll want to look at here. We could also look at implementing a caching server into the environment. So this would be any Mac that has the content caching service enabled under System Preferences and Sharing. So essentially, once the device connects to the same network that this Mac is on, the first time any piece of content that would come from the App Store is downloaded, it'll also be cached locally on the machine's hard drive, on the Mac's hard drive. So when the second machine or device reaches out, it'll just grab its content directly from that machine instead of going all the way out to Apple. So this can greatly reduce network load, especially in larger environments that may be doing large rollouts simultaneously.
So one of the questions was along the lines of just options for renaming devices as part of enrollment. On iOS devices, as we mentioned, there's an ability to add a naming convention into your DEP pre-stage. I showed the settings for what it would look like to use a serial number. The other options within there are default names, so I think everything becomes like just the name of whatever the hardware of the device is, so iPad, iPad Pro, iPad Mini. The other option beyond that is a list of names. But the way that works essentially is you provide a limited list of names that you'd like the devices to use. As devices enroll, they just grab the first name available, and then the next one that enrolls grabs the second one and subsequent. So it just sort of, as they enroll, they just check off whatever name has been taken. If you're doing a bunch of devices all at once, they're just going to grab whichever one they get to first. So if you're trying to assign them 1 through 30, in a particular classroom setting or something like that, that may not go in order of what you think that you've allowed them to grab. So the other options besides using pre-stage, there is some tools like the mass update tool where you could have a CSV file of names that you'd like to use and all your serial numbers within 2 columns, and use that tool to update and enforce the mobile device name to something else. That might be more appropriate if you're trying to name a specific device a specific name, rather than relying solely on just the list of names options. So I think we're getting to the end here. I want to be respectful of your time, and so I wanted to thank you for joining us today. Like I mentioned, we did record this session, and we will have it available online for you to view. If there's any questions that come up afterward that you might be thinking of, or any questions about the resources or things that we talked about today, I encourage you to check out Jamf Nation and some of our technical information, as well as contact a Jamf representative if you're looking for specific details of some of the workflows that we talked about. With that, thank you very much for attending.